Good evening, everyone. My name is Young-Han Koo. I'm one of the elders and the co-chair for the 70th Anniversary Symposium of the Korean Church of Boston. On behalf of the members of Korean Church of Boston, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you, including those of you who are joining our program virtually. We have two distinguished speakers this evening. Elder Elona Street-Stewart and Dr. Paul Cha. So after each speaker's presentation, there will be a 10-minute Q&A session. So please hold your questions until then. And the microphone that you see in the middle is specifically set up for the Q&A session. Our first speaker is Elder Elona Street-Stewart. And at this time, please welcome Reverend Samuel Son, who will be introducing her. Thank you.
This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. The Lord is risen. You guys are really good with Christian greetings. So what about this? What's up? What's up, Rev? Okay. I am so tempted to say, come on up closer. Right? Maybe the last row should be the first row. The last will be first. Come on. Encourage our speaker. Come up, come up, come up. Okay. I have the honor to introduce our first speaker of the symposium, Elder Elona Street-Stewart. Now, her CV is long. That's why I have this, right? But even this doesn't really exhaustively tell us all that she has done for the church and for the world. I'm going to go through some of this. She is a member of Delaware Nanticoke, a ruling elder and active community volunteer in St. Paul, Minnesota. She is a Synod executive for the Synod of Lakes and Prairies. After having already spent 20 years as Synod program staff for racial ethnic ministries and community empowerment. Half of that included time as deployed administrative staff for Dakota Presbytery. It just gets tiring just to talk about all this stuff, right? I don't know how she did all that stuff. Elona has served the PCUSA on racial justice matters in mission development, denominational policies, and educational programs since 1980. That's when I came to America as a little boy. On a variety of committees, including the Council on Church and Race, Advocacy Committee on Racial Ethnic Concerns, Presbyterian Women, relocation of the General Assembly agencies, and self-development of people. And every one of those has a story, doesn't it? A lot of sweat and tears. She has facilitated grassroots collaborations and national advocacy on racial equity, Indian education, family empowerment, and public policy. And on top of all that, she was elected as co-moderator of the 224th General Assembly of the PCUSA with Reverend Gregory Bentley in June 2020. Macalester College conferred on her an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters in June 2021. Her Delmarva, and if you know that, then you are from Delmarva, roots and Bachelor of Science in Anthropology enliven her passion for church and national history. And I just want to add a personal note as I got to know her this weekend. Despite all the things that she had to suffer with the discriminations that's set against her, she served so faithfully, led so faithfully, and she is still smiling. And you remind me of a mentor of mine, my mother, a pastor's wife. She had so many challenges in her life, and even the role of the pastor's wife pressed her in so many ways. And every time she smiled, I said to her, "Are you happy?" Because I couldn't believe she was happy being a pastor's wife. But she said, "Yes, I am genuinely, sincerely happy." She created a role for herself, even though many people denied her possibilities. You remind me of my mom, who is my mentor. So would you welcome me? Welcome with me, Elona.
Thank you. Well, good evening. You know, it's always an honor to be told you are like someone's mother. That is really important, and I love hearing that. So that way I can use my hands to talk and not to hold that. I am very pleased to be here, and I truly appreciate and give a great warm greeting to all of you who have planned this event, who have made it possible for us to be here tonight. I thank the leadership of the church. I thank Reverend Lee, who's not only served as my chauffeur, he's been watching my coat for me, and for everyone else who has been so gracious in your hospitality. And part of why I want to say this is, in your wisdom, you have invited me to make sure that even as you discuss and celebrate the 70 years of history of this congregation and its part in the world of the mission to Korea and those whose families came here and continue to be strong in their culture, their language, and their contributions to the world. You invited an indigenous woman, not just to be the beginning bookend of your event, but to say, tell us about the part of the history that needs to be uncovered because so many people don't know that. And that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock because I'm expected to be able to talk about over 500 years of history of contact and 15 to 20,000 years of our existence here in this place. But I'll do my best, and I'll talk about those early colonial years. And as I begin, I think that our theme title, The Two Tales of a City Upon a Hill, Unlocking the Past for a Better Future Today, unlocking and uncovering that which was erased or hidden or intentionally dismissed to make sure that we will have a future together because indigenous people are still here. So what have you been taught about history? History not only of this country, but history around the world about contact across the oceans from those in a place called the Old World, coming to, quote, discover the New World, where people had lived for thousands and thousands of years. As an indigenous person, we were told that we really don't belong here anymore, that this is someone else's land. It's not ours, it's no longer indigenous, that we're a forgotten part of the past, and that we are more of a symbol of true America, which is why you'll hear things like Jeeps called Cherokee, why you'll hear missiles by our military called Apache, and why there will be sports mascots whose names I won't even mention. I remember going to school, and even though I'm from the East Coast here, in our history books, our people were overlooked. And any mention of Native people, we were identified as savages and other horrible things. We only heard one side of history, but we know that we still have a chance to continue to tell the whole truth because it is coming out while we are still here. We were democratic societies. We were people that not only were surviving, but we were thriving here. We had our own governments, our own trades, our own languages, our own arts, our own nations, and our own spiritual practices that were very related to the actual land on which we lived. And all of that was taught in a way to say, love your relatives, be honorable of your relatives, and your relatives include not only other humans, but all four-footed, and those with wings and those with fins. and that water itself is a gift of life from the Creator. And without water, we will not exist. So I invite you to sit here with me tonight and not only to listen, but to unlearn some things with me about being the original witness, and to understand that I know being indigenous in America actually means carrying history no one else wants to hold. So in my introduction, I'm going to start in a very native way. I want to tell you about how we honor all of creation and how it's a relative of ours and how we grow together. As a Delaware Nanticoke, it's my honor to welcome you with a traditional greeting from my Algonquin ancestors. And even though my people were more in the mid-Atlantic area, the Delmarva Peninsula, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Jersey, Pennsylvania, a little bit of Connecticut, we were related to the people here because of our Algonquin language base. And so these are my relatives here. And so I want to respect them, that I am in their place. They are not here speaking for themselves tonight, but that I want to do all I can to respect them. And I want to tell you about some of our other relatives that we call our three sisters. And those are corn, bean, and squash. These are our relatives, and they still have much to teach us about what it means to be in community with each other, with the past and with the future. And the promise offered by these three relatives is bound up in each generation of their seeds, so that we may never forget, that we may never go hungry, and that we may never go without hope. Whenever you talk to Native people, you know we always have to talk about the natural world. And so as I come here tonight, I want to say that corn actually welcomes you here this evening. And when we plant them together. And the people here did that same planting technique as my people did down in Delaware. Corn is the firstborn of those seeds when they're planted. And it grows straight and stiff. It makes a leafy ladder, and it has to grow tall very quickly. Making a strong stem is its priority at first, because it needs to be there for the younger sister, the bean. Without corn support, beans would just grow. Those of you that have gardens, you know how they just become a tangle on the ground. But corn carries the bean up towards the sunlight. Corn is the supporting sister. Bean also welcomes you tonight. And we had beans in some of our food, didn't we? You're right, okay. Now, bean grows on very long vines, extending its touch until it finds what it's looking for, the corn stem. And where bean wraps herself around the corn in an upward spiral, pulling nitrogen from the air and bringing it to the soil so that all three sisters can benefit. Bean is the giving sister. Squash welcomes you. Squash, the late bloomer, steadily extends herself over the ground, moving away from the corn and the bean, setting out broad, big, rain-diverting leaves. And as they grow wider, they shelter the base of the corn and the beans, keeping moisture in and other plants out. Squash is the protecting sister. So say thank you for gathering here as a community. Say thank you for being a community who's being taught to remember first, and then apologize for not listening to what our three sisters have taught us, for failing to do all that which is good and right. My question to you is, as we talk about healing the hurts of people who have been disconnected, and following the trails of tears of people who have survived and those who were victims. Let's pray for our children and their children's children, growing up unaware that they belong together. May they know that they were born by those who stood for love and compassion against hatred, destruction, horror, and loss. We are so much better when we celebrate our place of belonging. So are you the supporting sibling? Are you a giving sibling? And are you a protecting sibling? I bring you those greetings out of my native world. My goodness, let's go back 500 years so that we can uncover some of the truths of Christian contact with Native Americans. This will all be for you a history lesson, and I hope that you're able to hear the things that I have to say, because I truly want to reflect on this past history of Protestant mission from various perspectives, particularly that from an indigenous perspective. And I can't speak for all Native people. We have over 600 tribes, but I will speak honestly from my own experience and the experiences that I've gained and have been interpreted to me by those that I work with within my community. And I want to start with this period of contact between the Pilgrims. They were called the Separatists, who fled England, and the indigenous people who were already here. I know that it's going to feel like I'm talking about many negative things, but it was a time of trauma where the world was changed and really completely turned upside down. But in our talking tonight, with me beginning these words with you, and then as we continue the phenomenal history stories that are going to be shared for the next 2 days, we want to be able to eliminate historical accuracy, spiritual truths, and talk about restorative justice. And I hope when we get to our question and answer time, that's what we'll be doing with. It's important to understand how we actually decide what is truth or what is an illusion. In this country, please hear me, that Native Americans are commonly portrayed in the national consciousness, in popular media, and in our church records, in images and stories full of stereotypes, or as a vanished and conquered element, not even humans, but an element like the landscape of the past. And so as we hear stories about the struggles of indigenous people, you should also know that I am very filled with stories of wisdom, our resiliency, and what we're doing about healing from that trauma. But I do want to make sure you understand the truth that has not been told yet, and that's what I will focus on tonight. And so, as we talk about these histories that lead us to current mission efforts, please know that in the presentations that talk about mission to Korea, the preface to all that must be the indigenous story. Anytime in this globe you talk about mission outreach, do not overlook the before that beginning, the before that is the story of indigenous people all over the globe. And for us, this was our homeland, and Protestant mission viewed us and their expanse in settlement as a secondary tool for colonization. I won't talk much about the doctrine of discovery. Sojung knows that we can go on for hours about that. But beginning by a pope in the 1400s, who declared that at the time of exploration, that any explorer could take possession of land that they discovered and subject the inhabitants to perpetual enslavement for the King and Queen of Spain if they weren't under the domain of Christian leaders. Now, I imagine that we will see the relevance for that in Korea. I want to share with you, though, the indigenous perspective from this continent. And so Columbus and all those who followed were taking part in a well-established tradition of legal authority. And in 1493, the year after Columbus sailed, the Pope Alexander VI issued another papal bull granting Spain the right, Spain, a country about this big, the right to conquer lands to be discovered in the future. And then Portugal decided they wanted what Spain had. And so they took what was the known globe of the world, and they divided it down the middle of the ocean with the meridian line, and each of them could claim the east or the west hemisphere of this entire globe. Well, the Protestant countries in Europe thought that sounds pretty good to us as well. And so they joined in. And the conquest of the continents of North and South America, our islands, and Africa by Christian monarchs was used to oppress people and became the bedrock on which the United States and other nations rationalized their domination by a code of international law. It was both theological and a political justification for the appropriation of lands and resources, slave trade, colonization, and genocide. And in 1823, the doctrine of discovery itself was adopted into U.S. law by the United States Supreme Court in a property case that assumed the ultimate dominion of land over native rights when Supreme Court Justice Chief John Marshall issued a statement that said, during the Age of Discovery, American Indians, the indigenous people who had lived here for 10,000s of years, had lost their rights to sovereignty as independent nations and only retained the right to occupy place on this continent. Dear Lord Jesus, how does that happen? And what happened here in Massachusetts? Well, here in the Northeast, you have woodland native cultures, and they covered the area from Maine down to my people, down in Delaware and Maryland, and certain provinces in Canada. And we had two language cultures, Algonquin, that I mentioned earlier, and the Iroquoian. And their societies were formed as confederacies. And so we had several confederacies that included the Abenaki people, the Maliseet, the Micmac, the Passamaquoddy, and the Penobscot people. In this area, you may know about the Wampanoag. They were people called the people of the first light because the light that comes up every morning comes to them first. They've lived here for thousands of years. But today in your state, and if this is incorrect, because we know things change sometimes very quickly, you only have two federally recognized tribes. They are both part of the Wampanoag Confederacy. One is the Aquinnah Wampanoag, and the other is the Mashpee Wampanoag. But there are two recognized tribes out of all those people that had lived here. Other tribes in the region were the Pequot, the Nipmuc, and the name of your state, Massachusetts, was a name of people. But unfortunately, when the Europeans came, they brought diseases as people in the cargo that they carried and in the animals that they had on board those ships. Our people had no immunity against most of those diseases, and so there were deadly epidemics. And about the time that the Puritans were dealing with their issue of leaving Europe and heading over to the Netherlands, there was a pestilence here in 1617, followed by a smallpox epidemic, which wiped out most of the remaining members of the tribe. And just a historical note for you, that we understand that in those first 50 to 60 years of contact, wherever that happened, whether it was in the Caribbean islands, here in the southeast of the United States, or mid-Atlantic, or here in New England, it is estimated that 85% to 90% of the native population died. That's a lot of people. And so when this cargo ship called the Mayflower arrived, it wasn't arriving because it was a Christian endeavor. It was financed by a British corporation that was looking for land and resources. And the Puritans, who wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England, got on board that ship. They landed in Patuxent in 1620. But they originally had been set to land where? Do you remember? Down by Jamestown. But the weather was too bad, so they kept traveling north. So once again, you have explorers on a ship getting lost, and then claiming when they arrived that that was their new home. The irony. Months after their arrival, and some of you know they lived on the ship for a very long time. They weren't on land. One of the Wampanoag leaders stopped by. His name was Samoset, and he talked to them in English. And they were pretty amazed, as they should have been. He had learned English from the fishermen that had already been here from Europe. And he told them about how the plague had wiped out the indigenous villages in the region. He also told them about their chief leader, Massasoit. And the chief eventually also came by with another native man, Tisquantum. And some of you know from your Thanksgiving story that his name was Squanto. And they talked about maybe forming an alliance if these people on this ship were going to live here out of native hospitality. They wanted to know, well, how long will you be here and what can we do to help you? And so they formed an alliance of friendship. Squanto himself, by the way, also spoke English. And do you know why? Because when he was a child, he had been kidnapped. He had been kidnapped and sold into slavery in England. He learned English there, ran away 2 times, and then made it back here to his own village, where he discovered that he was the sole survivor of his village because everyone else had died in the plague. Now, during this time, the way Native people tell this story, it's like these guests show up at your house. And you say, well, welcome, come on. If you're hungry, we'll feed you. If you're cold, we'll help you stay warm. If your clothes are worn, we'll help show you that you can wear our clothes to stay warm. We'll show you where to hunt. We'll show you where to plant a garden. But come, live with us because you don't have a home. And so those strangers moved in. But as Native people say, they started to become unruly. They started to take over the house. They started to tell the owners of the home, the Native people, we don't want you to come in this room now. This is our room. And then pretty soon they started shutting the doors to say to us, you can't live in this house. You must live outside. And in fact, if you come to the house, we're going to charge you for breaking the law. And the charge that we're going to make for you violating our possession of your home will be in perhaps wampum, those things that you use as your currency. And if you don't give us enough wampum, we're going to turn that into a mortgage. And those of you that do economy studies and real estate, Native people were taxed or charged if a wolf came and ate a pig, or charged if they decided to hunt in the places where they had been hunting for 1,000 years, and the settlers said, this is now our land. Ultimately, you need to know that they were mortgaged out of most of their land, and then debt was created, and then that debt was charged against them as a tax that would continue. And a lot of those early treaties were that way. This is history you may not know or have ever heard. So treaties were made, and those treaties may have been kept alive for decades. We have a word from one of the Pequot men over 100 years ago that said, these treaties were made by the Pilgrims and the Indians. The young chiefs during this time showed the Pilgrims how to live in their country and find support for their wives and their little ones. And for all this, they were applauded for being savages. The two gentlemen chiefs were Squanto and Samoset, who were good to the Pilgrims. And so in 1621, the 53 surviving Pilgrims on that ship celebrated their first harvest, and we remember that as Thanksgiving. Although they didn't call it that, it was a harvest festival. And in the original transcript, there's only 2 of events at that time. The native people pretty much brought the food. And there were 90 Indian men who came and brought them 5 deer. But that's not the way it's always recorded. Because folklore suggests that that first Thanksgiving was this idyllic feast. And there's a myth that treats it as if it meant that the Pilgrims were the first people here on this continent from Europe, that they had this wonderful holiday where they were so thankful for their harvest. What it doesn't tell you is that they had plundered in that empty village where all the Indian people had died the harvest that they had stored for their own winter, that they had opened graves and they took out the belongings of people out of the graves to survive. It also ignores the fact that the Wampanoag brought most of the food. And it also ignores the fact that there were people here from Europe, the French, the Finns, other English, the Dutch, who had been living all the way from Florida up into Canada and in the Southwest, starting villages by that time. We also know that what was happening in other places nearby, in what is now Connecticut, even Roger Williams, the pastor who was so fervent about religious freedom, he condemned the Pilgrims for the way they were treating natives. I hope our seminary courses are teaching that as well. So the chief died in 1662. His sons then began to build more relations with the European people. And in the years between 1621 and 1660, more than 40,000 Puritan settlers flooded this region. And we know that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was then chartered, and the settlers, as part of that charter, assumed that they were acquiring land from the native communities, and it became their private property. Where in our world, we had no private property. We did not recognize individual ownership of land. If they were given money, it was considered being given as a gift for the use of the land for hunting and fishing. There were 2 worlds colliding, coming together. So when they realized that these unruly guests started to take over, they began to fight back and to resist. And we have a series of conflicts that emerged. They began to try to drive the squatters out of their territory. They themselves burned down villages, and they attacked the settlers. But the settlers formed militias. And those militias organized to attack and burn Indian villages. One of those in your area, in your own backyard, killed over 700 Pequot men, women, and children. And in 1638, Puritans forced the local Indians in Connecticut into a reduced land base, creating the first reservation. So the natives became owned by and ruled by the English agents. They were prohibited from leaving their own land or allowing other native people to come visit them or to be part of their communities. They were not allowed to bear arms, and they were forced to convert to Christianity. Now, I am very proud to be a Native woman who is Christian and to be part of the Presbyterian Church. But I can tell you that in my ancestors' time, it was either be shot, burned, or become Christian. One of the early missionaries in this area was John Eliot. Hopefully your seminary studies teach you that, and I'm looking at the Presbyterian folk here. One of the things that John Eliot did, he is responsible for the first translation of a printed Bible. And he did that in Algonquin. So the first Bible published here in the United States in 1661 was printed in Algonquin. Missionaries like John Eliot began to say, we want to separate Native people who became Christian from those who did not become Christian. And they created what they called praying towns, or the praying brethren. The Mohican people, which now live in Michigan and Wisconsin, are part of that. I'm their ancestor. Our people were considered the grandfather of the Mohican. And you had these praying towns, which we can be careful of saying how much we appreciate that. Because when the villages were being burned, they burned down praying towns as well. And they made it impossible for people to escape. And so becoming Christian did not save you from the racism at the time or the genocide that was happening. I'll continue to go on. Let me talk a little bit more about the conflicts, and then let's look further ahead. When the British then really began to settle here and see this as their area, they formed even more militias. And ultimately, as you know, we had a war for independence with the British over that. But in the meantime, they began to demand even more land from Native people who were allying themselves with both settlers and colonists, with the French, with the British, with the German people. There were all different nations at the time. There was no concept of being pan-Indian or continent-wide Native American. They were joining alliances based on what they felt were going to be in the best interest of their people. But what was happening was that those European differences were being fought on our homeland, and Native people were just being conscripted into that process of helping those Europeans fight their own wars. Here's a comment way back in the 1790s from a Seneca leader who said, "You say that you were sent to instruct us how to worship the Great Spirit agreeably to his mind. And if we do not take hold of the religion which you white people teach, we shall be unhappy hereafter. You say that you are right and that we are lost." How do you know this to be true? You tell us that our religion is written in a book. If it was intended for us as well as for you, why has not the Great Spirit given it to us? And not only to us, but why did the Great Spirit not give it to our forefathers, the knowledge of that book, with the means of understanding it rightly? We only know what you tell us about it. How shall we know when to believe, being so often deceived by the white people? That was in 1790. After the War for Independence, between 1784 and about 100 years later, Indian tribes across this continent were forced to sign away over 2 billion acres of tribal land in over 700 separate treaties and land cessions. Our independence was sacrificed so they could claim theirs. But we are still here. And while the United States was threatened by the invasion of England and the loss of their independence, they failed to see that they had done the exact same thing to the indigenous people here. One of your colleagues, Eric Barreto, we all probably have sat in classes that he has taught. He has this to say: we create boundaries around belonging. We assume guardianship of belonging to God. Settlers possessed the God of their narrative of discovering a new land in the nowhere. When we go to middle of nowhere, we find that it's not that God has been absent, but that God has been actually already ahead of us. God is present there. God is in the business of making nowhere God's own home. So where are these places in our churches? If we think we don't bring God with us, God will never be there. God is already present and living and acting and making a difference in those places. God is always present, and God moves far ahead of us. We encounter the boundaries that we create around belonging. Not everyone is welcome. We've been confused and resistant if God has called a people clean, who we call unclean or savages. We need to see the shape and the breadth and the shape of God's mystery. How outstanding to see God doing the unexpected. God moves far ahead of us. The other thing I would say to you is that there are lessons here. As I begin your symposium, I welcome the histories that you're about to share with each other, the photographs of the stories of your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, of the sacrifices they've made and of the obstacles that they met with challenge and great hardship. There is a lesson in realizing the value of an alternative perspective, though, and that is why Native people are still here. That is why the Creator allowed some of us to remain as remnant people in spite of all the attempts to destroy us. And so don't forget that when we walk toward the light to see things in new ways, don't overlook that we're actually still walking in darkness, the darkness of the past that we bring forward with us into the light. It's easy to ask God to let the people go, but so difficult for us to let Pharaoh go. So come sit with us as Native people, come listen, and come unlearn with us. The difference for our people between hope and faith as Christians, we are faithful people, but we don't have hope that America and the church will repent its brutal oppression and erasure, its genocide and its enslavement toward us. Just a couple of weeks ago, we heard from the Vatican that the Vatican itself was repudiating the doctrine of discovery. And that was in a very important moment. But it didn't change the law in any country or in any state of the United States. It's up to those nations and those legislative bodies to address colonization and to change laws that were based on discrimination and ethnic cleansing of indigenous people. We continued to be able to provide the resources for this country to grow. And even though the doctrine of discovery now has been repudiated by the Presbyterian Church and many other denominations, there is still a lot of cleaning to do, restoring to do, and healing to do. And doing the healing that is going to be required of our states, our municipal authorities, our government, and our churches, they're not equipped to do that without us, because we are exceptional at doing this work, and we are the expert authority on what was necessary in this continent. And so I ask you, as one of our leaders up in Canada just said recently, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share the same past, there can be no real community. Community is lacking. If you want to build real community, you need to start by creating a common memory. That will be a genius way and get us to the heart of the challenges around racism. If we don't have common memory, we will only remember a mythological history of discovery and opportunity and exceptionalism. But if we can come together and imagine not only a common past, but a future together, there will be many opportunities for us to heal and work together in acts of restorative justice. And so I share that with you today, that my story is not a Mayflower story or a story of exporting Christianity across the ocean to Korea. My story is the Longhouse story of the people that lived here first, who offered the first prayers here, who sang the first songs here, and gave thanksgiving to the Creator here first. We do have another vision of how we can live and work together. And so you are not alone in your discoveries, but please make sure that you do not overlook those of us that remain still here as part of the testimony of the truth of those colonial eras. I thank you very much for letting me speak. And while you may not be completely prepared for questions right now, if you do have some, please ask. But throughout the next 2 days, I will still be here and will be participating in the panel where I'd like to engage with some of your other speakers around these histories of mission, global mission in particular, and what this means for indigenous people on this continent and around the world. Please, you'll have to use the mic. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Carol Han, Kim Kyung-e. I'm a member of this church for the last 50 years. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We happen to live in South Natick. Yes. And then we heard some story of Algonquin Indians. And then the language they used was, we were told, was the first Bible, Indian languages translated into. So I was wondering whether any other Indians, there are many different kind of Indians, whether, Bible was translated with other Indian languages too.
Yes, there have been. And in fact, many of those texts are still available in worship today. There are also translated hymnals. Those of you that may know in the Presbyterian Church are Choctaw people. They're wonderful singers. Their tradition had been singing, and they've turned that into their Christian worship as Presbyterians. So they have a Choctaw hymnal. I'm personally familiar with both the Dakota Odawan hymnal and the Nez Perce hymnal. Methodist, Episcopals, and UCC churches, I believe, have also had not only translated biblical scripture texts, sometimes maybe both the Old and New Testament, sometimes it may have just been the Psalms, and they also would have hymnals. And it was very important for many of those churches to request for a time when they could that their pastors spoke their traditional languages. Unfortunately, I know like in Dakota Presbytery, those persons who grew up speaking the language are now passing on. And so until we continue to provide language classes for younger generations, worship will mostly be in English, but they sing and pray in their native languages. And so I'm one who's very supportive, not only of federal dollars going into Indian language preservation and revitalization, but I also want to be able to see that happen more in the church. The presses, the publishing companies that do that work are not John Knox Press or Westminster Press. They belong to other corporate bodies and other denominations. But if there's ever a chance that you get to support that work and to let them know how vital it is, or to increase the distribution of those Bibles and hymnals, please do so. That would be a wonderful gift.
Thank you. I'm a new member of the Long Island Presbytery, and one of my friends there said, hey, let's go to Shinnecock Nation, and let's try to do some mission work there. And and at first I was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. If we're going to spend our mission dollars somewhere, we might as well bless the people to whom we owe a great debt in some vague way. So it was mostly guilt that made me think I should go and do this. Can you tell me, as I plan to do this sometime in the fall, what should I not do? Like, can you think of like one or two things that I definitely shouldn't do? And can you also suggest maybe what I should be looking forward to learning or seeing God do it when I go and make that visit?
Right, well, thank you. The Shinnecock Presbyterian Church is the longest surviving mission church in the United States. I think their years of formation were about 1748 or something like that. It's always like questionable when they actually started. And they have had native pastors as well as non-native pastors over time. And it's wonderful that they still continue to be part of the Presbyterian Church. So one of their retired pastors, Reverend Mike Smith, who now I think has joined the board with Cook School or the Cook Foundation, would be a wonderful resource for you to contact him. I don't know who's actually filling the pulpits right now. There are a couple of things. You don't, and I can't imagine you doing this, but you don't say how. Although that is a greeting, how kola or how koda is a greeting in Dakota, but Indians don't say how. And recognize that these are people who not only serve in their church, you have several tribal attorneys, judges, business people who are part of those congregations, and they live in a world where there's huge poverty, as well as great resistance, as you know, because on the rest of the island or peninsula, there's a challenge to their continuing to develop their casino or their gaming operations, their ability to have free access to the beaches and to continue to do clamming. So when you go, you would want to ask them about what are some of their current enterprises and what's the challenges that they are facing around being able to provide a sustainable economy for themselves. But they have an incredible history because similar to my people and other East Coast tribal nations, we were not recognized by the government because the assumption was after the War for Independence, all Indians disappeared. And they just were not seen. But they have, through, again, some of their tribal attorneys who are Presbyterian women, they gained federal recognition after decades and millions of dollars to be able to gain their federal recognition. And so you might want to say to them, you know, what are they looking forward to in the next generation about being able to provide their tribal rights and the protection of their sovereignty within their own boundaries. The other thing about them is, you know, they're right in the backyard of the Shinnecock golf courses and the whole golf tournaments, which is also just an incredible kind of story because a lot of the young men from the tribe served as golf caddies to rich, wealthy people who just continue to like ignore them, but they all grew up, you know, golfing, and they're probably golf experts. So if that's a sport that you enjoy, you also might find something surprising about going out there and asking to maybe golf with them, but it may not be on those same courses. That's all I can say. Okay, sure.
First, thank you so much. I'm having difficulty formulating the question, so I'll try to work it as I go. I went to school up in Vancouver at Regent College, and the church that I served at initially, Surrey Presbyterian Church, they had long done missions with the First Nations people of British Columbia. And so every summer we would go up way, way far up Prince George, all the way up to King Colex and New Ianch and all these different areas and serve in the reservation. The angle, if you will, that was taken by the church originally was that we as a people, Korean people, we were imperialized and we kind of went through the same type of heartache as the natives did. And so that was kind of the angle that we took in order to, quote unquote, evangelize. And as I'm hearing a story that I didn't, and a history that I wasn't very well aware of, again, this may not even be more of a question, but just kind of your thoughts on it. As a second-gen Korean, we're kind of in the position of we had missionaries come to us, and then things happened, and there's a part of us that always feels like we kind of lost who we were in some of that sense, and then the more you learn about Korean history, and then the missionaries coming in.
Sure.
So it's this understanding of, the thing that you said was, think about the past before the missions began, right? That's where we want to begin, what happened before. I'm wondering where the connections are for you as you kind of see our history. And then part of the symposium's goal is to connect the first and the second and the third gen and onward here in America while we try to still remain part of our rooted history in Korea as Koreans, right? And that's a second gen struggle that we always have. And so I'm wondering kind of your perspective, and it's not a question, it's more just like a rambling statement, but how do you help us to see from your perspective, again, as a way of saying, there's something about who we are that is native to who we are that we need to remain and hold on to, right? That alternate perspective that you want to consider, that's why you remain here, right? That's a profound statement. So how do we kind of understand that as a people who aren't in our own land, trying to find space as part of, right? In a land that's not ours, right? Displaced from our own land, which is a different perspective. And so I begin with that missions story because, again, we came from a similar perspective, right? That back in our homeland that we were, kind of the way the natives were. But now it feels like the story has switched a bit because we are no longer in our native land, and yet we're trying to bring the gospel to the people of the native land. So just kind of a...
I have to admit, I felt very challenged with the invitation because, especially with the title, city, the tale of two cities on a hill. But then I realized that, again, it is this issue of where do you belong, who are you, and when you go home, where is that home? And for me, I'm going to continue to provide my thoughts, but they're evolving. I think that your photographic descriptions, the text next to the pictures themselves say a lot. And even as I was watching other people look at the pictures, I could see them saying things like, we recognize that outfit or that location, or we recognize by the name of something. And I thought, that's exactly what our people do. When we go around, or maybe with museums and exhibits and things like that, it's like, oh, that was, the Cheyenne, or that was the Arapaho. But then people were reading the text, and I was reading the text out with those photos. The challenges around, what did it mean to seek your independence? And what would have happened if the Korean mission truly had become more indigenous? Because we know in that era of the late 1800s, early 1900s, that was happening all over the globe as well. People trying to say, can we maintain an indigenous Christianity here? And what would that look like? Because it had never existed before. So I want to learn with you, but I hope that we all unlearn some things together. And we were never immigrants or emigrants, but we were relocated across this continent. So many of us lost our own homeland area. Some people with reservations were able to maintain their own homeland. But that experience of being told by another body that we are denying you access to sustainable assets to provide family wealth and well-being, and therefore either because of political need, economic need, your own personal maybe like education need or jobs, those things, you have to leave your home. We understand that. I think for several generations of indigenous leaders, they were very vocal, well, some were very vocal, some were very silent, as Native people tend to be, about everybody who came here as an immigrant experience. And, you know, so in third grade classes in the United States, where you are asked to put a dot on a map where your family came from, our kids would say, well, we didn't come from any place else. We've always been here. And that was a challenge. Indian parents had to go to the schools and said, you got to redo that curriculum because it's not, you know, it's insulting for us. But we also now realize more that that sense of the immigrant experience, being able to maintain your language and your culture and your values and to prepare the generations behind you for the future is exactly what we're doing. And so I think we don't have like first or 1.5 generations or second generation, but our young people and the next generation and your young people and their next generation have probably more in common, being able to say, what were our ancestors doing? You know, can we really understand the kind of decisions our parents had to make? Can we understand the relationship they had with the church or with the government or with their own tribal people? Those will be the phenomenal conversations that I think we can imagine a better future for the whole world. But let's learn together and unlearn together. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for the thought-provoking, inspiring message. Thank you very much. We'll take a quick break, 5-minute break. We will begin our session 2 and 8:15, a little before 8:15. And our next speaker is Dr. Paul Cha, who will be introduced by Dr. David Unil Cho. Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you everyone for being here. My name is David Cho, and I'm honored to introduce Dr. Cha to you. Many of you here know me actually, and know me as a guy from Atlanta, but now I'm here, so I want to say welcome to Boston. Welcome to Boston, because many of you flew in this morning, this afternoon, so I know you are tired, but just want to appreciate your energy and commitment and willingness to learn and listen. So I just want to echo that appreciation, and welcome to Boston and KBC, yeah, KCB. So Dr. Paul Cha is an assistant professor of Korean Studies in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Hong Kong. He received his PhD from UCLA and his MA from the University of Chicago. He specializes in modern Korean history, and his first book, Balancing Communities, Nation, State, and Protestant Christianity in Korea from 1884 to 1942, was published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2022. He's currently visiting scholar at Harvard Yenching Institute, where he's working on his new book titled To Win the War for Christ, the Korean War and Faith-Based Humanitarian Aid. So that was a formal intro. Maybe more informal intro would be Paul. Dr. Cha and I had a brief encounter many years ago in Atlanta, where when I was a PhD student and he was a junior scholar, and actually he didn't remember that we had met. But last fall, many years later, I moved here for a teaching position, and Paul from Hong Kong came to Boston during his sabbatical. And then since then, it's been so good for me to have him as a mentor, as a colleague, and a friend, as a hyung. He asked me, how's your teaching going? How's grading going? Are you working on a book? You know, like in a loving way. Are you working on your book? You know, you're publishing in a really loving way. So it's been a blessing for me to get to know Paul, for me and many people in this church. So let us welcome Dr. Paul Cha.
All right, thank you, David, for that introduction. I'm sorry I don't remember you, but I remember you now. I want to thank the Korean Church of Boston and all the co-sponsors for inviting me here to speak to you. It seems like people have multiplied. Did people multiply during the first talk? It seems like there are more people back there. It's truly an honor to be here and have this opportunity to talk to you about a little bit of Protestantism, history of missions in Korea. But I want to start with an admission. I found preparing this talk to be very difficult because Reverend Lee, when he approached me with this talk, he said, oh, it's very simple. All I want you to do is talk to 3 generations of Koreans, right? And it's really hard to imagine an audience that's so diverse because the number one rule when you prepare, well, there are actually 2 rules when you prepare a talk. First one is don't go over time. And the second is think of the audience, okay? And the problem is, for some of you who grew up and were raised in Korea, like things about Korean history are going to be obvious, right? In contrast, if you were born and raised in America, maybe not so obvious. So it's really hard to prepare a talk with such a diverse crowd. So with that as a caveat, what I would like you to do is I would like you to be active listeners. And I don't expect everybody to come up, like understand everything that I speak about, but I certainly hope that you're able to pick 1 or 2 things away from today's talk that will inspire like further thought. Okay, so that's how I prepared this particular talk for today. Agreed? Can you do that for me? All right. So why are we here, right, today? Right? Ultimately, I think this 70-year anniversary for this church concerns the history of immigration, Koreans to the United States, right? And the importance of Protestantism, religion, for many Korean American churches. Now, my part in today's talk, or symposium, is to talk about the part that starts before immigration to the U.S. It's about the history of Protestantism's journey to Korea and how it took root. Now, the history of Protestantism in Korea is very much dominated or heavily influenced by the United States. So up to the first decade of the 20th century, oh, thank you, I have water. Okay, up to the first decade of the 20th century, about 1910, about 80% of all Protestant missionaries came as a member of one of 4 mainline denominations from the US, okay? So the Northern Presbyterians, Southern Presbyterians, we call them the Northern Methodists and the Southern Methodists. And why do we have Northern and Southern? It's very simple. Slavery, Civil War. So there was a schism. So we have Northern and Southern branches. And so very much so, when we talk about Protestantism in Korea, we're really talking about the United States. And it's been very heavily influenced by the United States. So keeping that in mind, the question that I would like you to consider for today is how should we understand the history of American Protestant missions in Korea? So how many of you have gone out into the hallway and looked at the pictures? I know at least one. Did everybody have a chance to do that? So when you were looking at those pictures, what did you think about? And this is an open question. I actually want an answer. What did you think about? And if nobody answers, I'm going to ask David, right? So what did you think about when you saw those pictures out in the hallway? David, they seem a little shy. Maybe you can help. Inspiring, right? These people are so why inspiring? That's such a blasé answer. But what was so inspiring? Okay, their dedication. So I assume their dedication, you're thinking about like their dedication to Christ, missions? Okay, I'm putting words in his mouth. Yeah, I mean, that's one obvious way of thinking about missionaries to Korea. I mean, they call them missionaries. But what I would like you to do today is to not think of them as missionaries. What I want you to think about is to think about them as migrants. They were migrants from the United States to Korea. Okay? So, I mean, you got to think about what life was like for them when they were going to Korea at a time when there were no Westerners in Korea. They were not just simply pioneers of Christianity in Korea. They were pioneers of life for Westerners. They were building the Western community. I mean, there was nobody who was proficient. I mean, there wasn't like, most of you who were second generation Korean Americans, you wanted to study Korean, you go to Yonsei University, right, and you go to Oakdang. There are no Oakdangs in Korea at this time. They didn't know how to speak the language. They didn't know what to eat, right? They didn't know where they were going to educate their children. They had to pioneer all of this. So if you really want to truly appreciate, understand the history of these American missionaries to Korea, you have to think of them as migrants, right? Immigrants almost. Now, I'm not saying that they were the same as immigrants, Korean or otherwise, to the United States, because these missionaries had lots of advantages that the average person doesn't have, right? But we're going to set aside the question of missionary power or missionary cultural imperialism or imperialism to the side for tonight, not because it's not important, because you've talked about it in part, but also because it's so complex that we need like a separate symposium. I'm not suggesting a separate symposium, but you would need a separate symposium to really discuss it, right? But instead, I want you to consider that they were a part of a migration, and you can't really truly understand the early history of Protestantism in Korea without understanding just the day-to-day struggle to live, right? To establish yourself in this country. Now, before I go on, I want to state that my wife, she's very smart, and she mentioned, there's no way that they're going to start at 8 o'clock for your talk, so we're going to go over, right? And she was right. And so I'm going to do my best to do this talk according to the original timeline and hopefully finish this by, 8, so about 9:10, and to open up to question and answers. So I promise you I'm going to try to get you out on the original, according to the original time. So that is the challenge. So let's go. Now, what we're going to do today is, let's see. All right. Oh, okay. So what I'm going to talk to you today is the first decade of the Protestant missionary movement in Korea, from roughly 1884 to 1893. Now, Protestant missionaries had tried to go to Korea before this, but they largely failed, okay? But in 1884, they're finally able to arrive in the Korean peninsula. But you need to understand that when they went to Korea, they weren't thinking of themselves as that this was going to be a temporary thing. Right? Of course, we call this foreign missions because it's foreign missions. They went to a foreign country. But their intention was to spend decades of their lives in Korea. So you have to, one of the amazing things when you go out and look at the pictures, I'm not sure if you have all the pictures there, but like for example, the Underwoods, they went to Korea, they got married in Korea, they had children in Korea, they had children who got married in Korea, and they had children in Korea, and they also went to Korea. And some of them died in Korea, right? So calling them foreign missionaries, I mean, there's something wrong, something odd about that, okay? So these are multiple generations of missionaries to Korea, and in many ways, they thought of Korea as their home. So in the same way that there may be second or third, well, maybe some third generation Korean Americans here today who think of the United States as their home, this is what the missionaries who are going to Korea, many of them felt. All right, so we're going to start our talk here in the present. And one of the reasons is I have this certain philosophy about history. Histories are the stories we tell about the past to understand the present, to gain wisdom how we should live in the future. Okay? So we're starting here in the present. This is Severance Hospital. Severance Hospital is one of the leading hospitals in Korea today. And Severance Hospital is located on the campus of Yonsei University. Yonsei University is one of the leading universities in Korea today. And if you walk through the main gate and go a little to the right, there's this building. And I know there are a lot of Yonsei University graduates in this classroom, you can see I'm a teacher. This sanctuary, what building is this? Yes, this is Jeju-won. Thank you. Okay, this is Jeju-won. When it was first founded, it was called Hwanghae-won, but then weeks later, it was changed to Jeju-won. Jeju-won is also a part of Yonsei University, or more specifically, it's a part of Yonsei University, and Severance Medical School or Hospital is past, right? Because it was the first Western-style hospital established in Korea, and it was jointly operated by both the royal family, the Korean government, and the Northern Presbyterian missions. And because of this, Yonsei University traces its history all the way back to the start of this hospital. And the reason being, there we go, okay. The reason being that in 1955, Yunni College and Severance Medical School decided to combine and form one university called Yonsei. Now, Yunni College was established in 1915, and it was established by the Protestant missionaries. So if you go there, there's a famous statue of Horace Allen out in front, or not Horace Allen, excuse me, Horace G. Underwood out in front with his hands open, right? Not exactly to scale, but I guess it looks to scale when you look up. Now, Yonsei University occupies a very important place in the history of Protestant missions, but it represents different things to different people. So for alumni of Yonsei University, it represents the start of higher Western education in Korea. If you're from Seoul National University, it represents maybe Yonsei University stealing your history. So this is one of the points of controversy, because Seoul National claims this hospital as a government hospital. So it's really the start of Seoul National. Sorry, Reverend Lee, I don't know if you're a part of that controversy. But for others, it represents Christian benevolence, right? The story of Jesus healing the sick, right? Christian love. For others still, it represents the arrival of Western technology and science, in particular to build a modern nation state. For others, and this is really important for those who view Protestantism in a favorable light in Korea, it represents the start of a close relationship with King Gojong and the missionaries. And this is a sign, supposedly, of why Protestantism succeeded in Korea, because Gojong and the missionaries got along. Now, you might be surprised to learn, however, that for the early Northern Presbyterians, Jeju-won represented none of these. What did Jeju-won represent? It represented the reason why the Northern Presbyterian missions was going to fall apart. It represented the reason why missionaries couldn't be missionaries. You see, what happens is, very shortly after this institution is formed, the first generation of Protestant missionaries to Korea, they become involved in a series of infighting. They start to fight. And these fights are not polite. I mean, like reading the missionaries' letters, it's really sort of odd. It's like, this person is a great person, I'm sure, personally, but I just cannot work with this person, right? It's just amazing to read these letters to see how vindictive they became. And so the question that I would like you to consider, what we're going to try to figure out today. I already know the answer, but hopefully I'll lead you along the role, is why? Why did they fight so much over this hospital? Why was it that this institution, which was supposed to be a shining light, at least initially, of God's favor, supposedly that showing that the Northern Presbyterian missions would succeed, why did it become a source of agitation and a source of conflict within the Northern Presbyterian missions? Okay, so this is what we are going to do today. Now, in order to tell this story, there are two narratives that I need to sort of creatively weave together for you. I've already told you sort of the first one. The first one is the story of the start of the Protestant missions in Korea. There is a second. The second is from the perspective of the Korean government and Korean society. It is the story of the opening of Korea to the West and the attempt to establish a modern nation state. Now, you have to understand both of these stories to understand exactly what's going on in Jejuwon. So we're going to talk about the second part of the story. So for those of you who were born and raised in Korea, apologies, but we're going to sort of plod through this to make sure we're all on the same page. Now, I know we're in America, so I might need to state this. Korea shares a border with China, okay, geography. And Korea and China have had a very long and complex relationship throughout its entire history. Unfortunately, once again, this is another one of those topics that we just don't have time to get into, okay? But what you need to know for today is that during the Choson dynasty, Korea, the Korean king, had to send on a regular schedule diplomatic missions to the capital of China, which is located in modern-day Beijing. Okay? Now, the Choson dynasty, for those of you who are unaware, is the last dynasty of Korea, 1392 to 1910. It is the first and the only dynasty in Korea that was primarily based on Confucian ideology. So some of you think of Korea and you think of traditional Korea in the past, you think, oh, Korea was always Confucian. That is not true, okay? Korea started to become Confucian, really Confucian, in 1392, and this will be important in a moment. Now, I was telling David a moment ago that there are probably, sorry David, I'm gonna keep coming back to you. There are some, I realized listening to some of the questions in the talk right before me, that there are probably things that I didn't add to my talk that I need to add, and this is one of them. There is a belief in Korean, the history of Korean Christianity, that the very first missionaries to Korea were, does anybody know? What? Oh, 장로님. No. The very first missionaries to Korea are Korean, right? So Korea was not first evangelized by Westerners. Okay, so this is the story that is normally given, that because Westerners were not the oppressors in Korea, bringing this foreign gospel into Korea, Koreans could adopt it. And of course, you should all know that the colonial power is not a Western power, it's Japan, right? So because of these two factors, that the first missionaries are actually Korean, and because the colonial power is Japan and not a Western nation, that Koreans legitimately could turn to Christianity and Protestantism. Okay, so this is the standard narrative that is given that is very different from the case that we discussed before. So as the story goes, the very first missionary to Korea is a Korean. Now, up to this point, I've been very, very careful. I made one mistake, but I only did it once. I've been very careful to use the term Protestantism in speaking, okay? The history of Protestantism, the formal history of Protestantism, really starts in 1884. The first resident Protestant missionary goes to Korea. Now, the history of Christianity is much longer. Okay? Now, it's at least 100 years longer because on these diplomatic missives to Beijing, Catholicism was already in China. And so as these Yangban, these scholar officials, they went to Beijing, they would, customarily go to the local bookstore, see what was what was selling. They would talk to other scholars, what's happening. And during these trips, they learned about Catholicism. And they started to bring some of these religious tracts back to Korea. And in 1789, a young man who accompanied his father on one of these diplomatic missions to China, he decided to go into the local cathedral. He talked to some Chinese Catholic priests, and in the course of their conversation, he's like, you know what? I want to be baptized. So he's baptized, the very first Korean Catholics baptized, at least the one that we have on record. And he, buys some religious tracts. He goes back to Korea, and he starts to pass them out to his family, his friends, his colleagues. It's like, let's read this stuff. And they start to read this stuff, and people started to convert. And before you know it, by the end of the 17th century, so about 1799, heading into the 19th century, there is a very sizable cohort of Korean Catholics, all before a Western missionary has gone into Korea to evangelize. But what happens is that Catholicism soon runs into a problem because there is one ritual in the Confucian system that Catholics are not allowed to participate in. Jesa, ancestor rituals, right? So this has been deemed by the Catholic Pope to be a form of idolatry. So Catholics are not allowed to participate. So the Jesa, ancestor rituals, is like the linchpin in the social and political system of this Confucian state, right? Because you have to properly honor your parents, right, in order to keep everything together, because it goes all the way up to the king. So if you stop doing the ancestor rituals, then the entire social political system is going to unravel. And so when the king learns of this, local officials are like, okay, we cannot have any of this. And they start a series of anti-Catholic purges. Now, it's estimated anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 Korean Catholics are executed during these purges during the 19th century. So I know the print is a little small here, so I'll tell you. So this is Yanghwajin Foreign Missionary Cemetery. So some of you, if you've been to Korea, you may have gone to visit this site. This is where a lot of the Protestant missionaries in particular are buried in Korea. It's in Seoul. It's actually very close to Yonsei University. And it's sort of like a tourist attraction now. You can go and you'll see like a short, I think it's like a 10-minute film on the early Protestant missionaries. You'll come out, guided tour of the cemetery, and then you go to this special exhibit hall. And by the way, if you don't speak Korean, not a problem. You call ahead. They have this translated into English, Chinese, I think also like a number of other languages. So you can go regardless. But in any case, if you go a little bit farther, okay, do I have it? You can see underneath, there's, oh, wait. There we go. Okay, so if you go a little bit farther, about 5-minute walk, there is this other memorial called Jeoldusan. Jeoldusan literally translated means decapitation mountain. Okay, and the reason is that during one of these anti-Catholic purges, supposedly they beheaded 2,000 Korean Catholics, and many of them just threw the bodies off this is on a big cliff, bodies off the cliff and into the Han River, and supposedly the river turned red as a result. I have little kids here. I'm sorry you had to hear that, right? But in any case, it was bloody. So this is the situation that is confronting the missionaries, the Protestant missionaries, when they go to Korea. They are going to see, or they're going to a country with very strict anti-Christian laws on the book, and a demonstrated history of executing those who practice Christianity. Now, this is why the missionaries, the Northern Presbyterians, when they first established Jejuan, this is why they're going to be so excited, okay? Just as a forewarning. Okay, now let's skip ahead to 1882. 1882, Korea finally signs its first diplomatic treaty with a Western nation, and it just happens to be the United States, okay? So with this, Korea becomes an open country to Westerners. What does open country mean, Dr. Cha? Yeah, okay, I can tell you that. That's a good question. So, open, what that means is prior to the signing of this treaty, Korea was closed to all, almost all, not all, but almost all foreigners. If you're a foreigner, you couldn't just go to Korea, land at a port, buy property, start a business. You couldn't live. You had no rights. People could not go to Korea. But with the signing of this treaty, Americans could now go to a certain number of ports that were opened to them. Okay, this is why we call this the open ports period. And so they could go to the port. They didn't need like special permission. They could land at the port. They could buy property at the port. They could live at the port, and they could reside at the port. So they could do all these things. And shortly after the signing of this treaty, many other Western countries will then sign treaties with Korea. Now, as soon as the American mission societies learned of this, they're like, ooh, Korea is open. Let's go. It's new land, right? It's age of exploration. Let's go to Korea. They wanted to go to Korea. And so a man by the name of Horace and Allen, he was a missionary in Korea. I think you have this out there in the hallway. He petitions his board to be transferred to Korea. And so they agree. And in August of 1884, he lands in Korea, and he is the first Protestant missionary to arrive in Korea, like as a resident. But when he arrives, he doesn't arrive as a missionary. He arrives officially as a doctor with the U.S. legation. Why this deception? Well, there's this very famous story where Lucius Foote, when he was the head of the U.S. legation, he introduces Allen to Gojong, and Gojong goes, "Is Allen a missionary?" And Lucius Foote says, "No, sir, he is not a missionary. He is a doctor." And the reason why he did this is because you cannot be a missionary. You cannot practice Christianity. You cannot spread Christianity. And Lucius Foote, in no uncertain terms, looks at Allen and he says, "Look, I know you are a missionary, but it's going to be many years, decades, before Christianity will be allowed in this country." But all of a sudden, something changes. It changes in December of 1884. Now, in order to understand what changes, you need to understand that when Korea signed this treaty with the United States in 1882, this was not the first step. This was another step in an attempt to create a modern nation state. They wanted to reform. They wanted Western technology. So even in the year prior to this, in 1881, they sent a group of very young scholar officials to Japan on this tour. And their job, or their responsibility, was to gain information on Western technology. Okay, so some of you may be asking, well, why did they send them to Japan and not the United States or these other places? Well, Japan had already opened to the West in 1850s, right? And then China even earlier than that. So these countries had already begun the process of westernizing and adopting Western technology. So you're the Korean government, it's like, okay, Japan, United States. Japan, okay, Japan's cheaper, it's closer, we'll send them to Japan. So they sent them to Japan, and you know, they learned all these things, right? They saw steamboats, wow, trains, weapons, and even indoor plumbing, right? They have warm water, right? So they're like, wow, this is so amazing. And then they learned about other things like democracy, human rights, right? All of these interesting concepts. So just imagine, you need to imagine what it must have been like for these people to witness and to see all these things. Okay. Now, I will tell you what they were thinking. They were thinking two things. One, wow, this is really cool. Two, wow, this is really scary. Why is this scary? Because one of the concepts that they learned about was something known as social Darwinism. Now, Darwinism, of course, natural selection, evolution. Well, social Darwinism was the application of Darwinism to society, nations, states, and the idea that survival of the fittest. So some nations are strong and they get stronger. Some nations and races are weak and get weaker, and it's only natural that the weaker nations are eaten up by the stronger ones. So you are Korea, you've gone to Japan, you've seen all this modern technology, and you've learned of social Darwinism. And you're like, the question is, are we fit to survive? Will Korea survive? And these people are looking at what's happening, and they're like, I don't think we are. So they go back to Gojong, they go back to Korea, and they say, look, we need to reform as fast as possible. We cannot wait. We need to be aggressive. But you got to imagine that, there's lots of different opinions in the Korean government. Most of the people in Korean government, they didn't go on this trip. What, steamboats? What is that, right? What, trains? Right? No, we're fine as long as we maintain our Confucian ideology. We have nothing to worry about. And so there are all these hardliners, these conservatives who are against reforms. And so what Gojong does is he decides this is the king, right? He decides we're going to take a moderate course, or like a modern pace of reform. But what happens when you try to compromise and you make everybody happy? You make nobody happy, right? So everybody's mad. So the hardliners are upset. The radical people who want to reform are upset. And so these young, I don't know what it is about youth, right? But these young men, they're all men, right? These young men decide, you know what? We got to do something drastic. So December of 1884, they lead a coup. So my daughter wanted to know why I used a cartoon. I couldn't find a better picture, sorry, okay? But this is exactly what happens, okay? Ujeongguk, that's the post office. I believe the exact date was December 8th, but in 1884, they're having a celebration in the capital to celebrate the establishment of this postal system, right? This modern postal system. So while this outdoor festival or celebration is going on, the leaders of the Gapching-ku, they set fire to a building close to the palace. So there's a fire, and all of a sudden they run to Gojong and say, Gojong, the Chinese are leading a disturbance in the capital. We need to secure your safety. So they take him to safety. Well, safety, right? It's basically house arrest. They arrest him. They put him in detention. He doesn't know what's going on. And then they take his official seal, and they start to stamp their own reforms. I have no idea why they thought this would work, but they start instituting all these modern reforms. And at the same time, what they do is they start to kill those who are the most hardline against reforms. Now, long story short, well, actually, short story even shorter. The coup only lasts 3 days, okay? Because they were not very smart. There were Chinese troops surrounding right outside of the city, and they just came in and put the coup down. But during this coup attempt, the nephew of the king, Min Young-ik, he's severely injured. And Alan is called to treat him. So Alan runs over and he sees, and according to his letter, I saw his body in a mangled state. But he's able to save him. And because he saves his life, supposedly he wins the good favor of the king, Gojong. He's made the official doctor of the king. He's appointed as a court official. And Alan decides, you know what? I'm going to use this as an opportunity to petition the king to start a hospital. So he writes a letter to the king, like a petition, formal petition, and says, we would like to start a Western-style hospital, royal hospital, with the doctors and salaries for the doctors provided by a benevolent society from America. And Gojung agrees. Now, why benevolent society? Well, that was the Northern Presbyterian Missions, but you got to remember, you cannot say by a mission society because you cannot practice Christianity at this point. So with this, Jejuwon now is established in 1885. I know there are a lot of years, so bear with me. 1885, and with this, the next two missionaries who come to the country, Horace Underwood, he comes in April. I'm glad this is all in the hallway, right? So if you were in the hallway, you would have been prepped for this. And then John Heron, he arrives a couple months later. And all three of these missionaries, by the summer of 1885, within less than 1 year has elapsed since Alan has arrived, all three of these missionaries have an official place in Korea. It's amazing, right? They're missionaries. They're in Korea. They have this close relationship with the Korean government in a country where Christianity is not allowed. So from the perspective of the mission board, now when I say mission board, this is like the head office in New York City, okay? These are the people who are sending these missionaries out to the field. They're excited. They're like, oh, we are doing well. But less than 1 year after this happens, like 6 months later, Alan submits a letter to the mission board saying, I quit, right? Like, this is crazy. I can't do this anymore, right? Our relationship in the field is not good. Now, Alan will rescind that letter, but what will happen is then the following winter, both Underwood and Heron will also submit a letter to the mission board saying, we quit, right? We cannot stand Alan. He's so annoying, right? So we cannot stand him. So this is not going to work. Now, disaster is averted in January, 1 month later. So after they submit this letter, the following month, Underwood decides, let's try one more time. And they come to a compromise, and the first disaster is sort of averted. Now, even with that being the case, the mission board back in New York City is saying, what in the world is going on in Korea? How is it that a mission that at first seemed to be a success, got off to such a great start, all of a sudden devolved into like all this infighting? Why did I put this next? Okay, I'm not sure. Oh, now I remember. Okay, so here we go. In order to understand why the mission board was so sort of distraught over what was happening, is the following. We need to talk about what a missionary was like. How many people here have been on a mission trip? I was thinking, okay, for 1 week, longer than 1 week, longer than 1 month, longer than a summer. Okay, winner. Okay, okay, yeah, many of you have gone on mission trips, right? But mostly, I would assume, for most of you, on a temporary basis, right? But the missionaries who went to Korea, they went as a member of a large-scale mission board. You have to think of these organizations as like a Fortune 500 company. They have stations literally all around the world, budgets in the millions and millions of dollars. Now, if you wanted to become a missionary in the 19th century, what did you need to do? Well, the very entry to even apply to become a member of one of these mission boards, you had to have a college degree. Okay, so in the United States nowadays, lots of people, I think, go to college. Not a big deal, I guess. 1870, 1.7% of the American population graduated from college. A very small percentage of Americans even qualified to apply to be a missionary. We're talking about the elite of American society, or at the very least, the most educated. Now, from that 1.7%, then you had to pass a very stringent application process. You filled out the application, then you had to list your references, and the mission board would send letters to your referees to recommend you. I mean, and these letters were serious. I mean, they asked you things. Please comment on this person's intelligence. Please comment on this person's personality. Oh, I don't know why this following question, but there was one question for, please comment on this person's looks, right? Like, was this person good looking or not? And then also, like, mind for business, right? So these were very, very stringent questions, not necessarily good questions, but it's not easy to become a missionary. So these missionaries, these people are being sent out to Korea. So how is it that these highly educated people who've been vetted for their personalities, right, and who supposedly share this common interest in spreading the heavenly kingdom, devolve into these conflicts? Well, I wanted to mention the Underwood, right, to talk about the elite. Underwood, Horace G. Underwood, his brother in the early 20th century ran and operated one of the largest and most successful and most powerful typewriter companies in the world. Right. So Underwood had lots and lots of money. Actually, Horace Underwood, his family financed a lot of the early Protestant missionary movement in Korea. It was a family thing. So the early conflicts over Jejuan really took place among the first cohort, the first 3 missionaries to Korea, Allen, Underwood, and Heron. And in particular, Allen and Heron, at least at first, didn't get along. So, like, what were they like? Allen complained that, in fact, the root of the conflict was the fact that Heron was jealous that Allen was the personal doctor of Gojong and had, like, this close relationship. Heron writes back and says, no, you know what the problem is? Allen is stealing money from the hospital, right? Embezzlement. And then Underwood chimed in and said, no. See, what the problem is, Heron doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't engage in frivolous activities. But Allen, he drinks, sometimes he smokes, and he likes parties. To which Allen then replies, well, yeah, I drink sometimes, but that's because my doctor said I should drink for my indigestion, so it's medicinal, right? But then he retorts that Heron, now I never swear, so I won't say this, but you can read it up here. He called me an A word, right? This is literally in the letter. It took me like a little bit to figure this out because I first didn't believe it. To which Heron then responds, no, Allen did this first. Like, reading the back and forth of these letters, they sound like children. You got to imagine from the perspective of the board, it's like confounding. It's a little embarrassing to talk about the early history of the Northern Presbyterian missions when you look at this conflict between Heron and Allen. So what in the world is going on? Well, they conflicted over several issues. One was the administration of Jejuan. The other, very closely related, had to do with mission policy. Now, Allen was dead set against open evangelism. He said, we got to stay within the law. In contrast, both Underwood and Heron said, no, we should pursue a more open, aggressive policy of being missionaries. Now, I want to point out that during these debates, there was a lot of pressure and tension because it was literally a life or death issue. To give you an example, in 1888, there was something known as the baby riots. So, in Seoul. So, there are many things that Koreans didn't quite understand about Western technology and religious practice for Christians. For example, up in the upper left-hand corner, there's camera. And how does these photography work? And there was a rumor that started that the way that it worked is when they took the picture, a part of your soul was transferred magically to the paper, right? So the Westerners were stealing people's souls, and that's why they wanted to take your picture. Now, there are other things that they didn't quite understand. One of the things that they didn't understand is, why did Western missionaries start orphanages? why did they want our babies? Why do they want to raise these children? What's going on? And a rumor started to circulate in Seoul that what the missionaries and Christians were doing was that they were draining the blood of children for their rituals. Now, this is really a criticism against Catholicism, because Catholics practice communion, but when they do communion, it's believed when the priest does this to the wine, the bread, it actually turns into the blood of Christ, right? And so, the Koreans heard about this rumor, and so they're like, wait, where are they getting this blood from? They're getting it from the children, right? And so in 1888, in the summer, there started this riot in Seoul, and the missionaries and the Western community were so concerned that they went to Gojong and said, you have to put this down, or we're going to send in troops that are sitting out in the harbor in Incheon if you don't. Okay? So they do. Gojong goes ahead and he suppresses these riots. But the very point is that Allen wasn't crazy, right? That this was literally a life or death sort of conflict. They were very, very concerned what would be the result. Now, there's this other thing that you need to I need to explain about the way Protestant missions or Presbyterian missions works. So it's very different from the Methodists, right? The Methodists, they appoint one person who's the superintendent, and that person makes the final say. Presbyterian missionaries, on the other hand, they get one vote each, right? Every male, not female, at least at first, every male missionary in Korea gets the vote. There are 3. It should have gone 2-1. Underwood and Heron should have, their position should have won out against Allen, right? So Underwood and Heron, they both want to be missionaries. Allen, he says, let's stay within the boundaries. But this is not what happens. Why? Well, this is where we get to Jejuan. Prior to 1884, the missionaries had no direct connections to Gojong. Right? They're not connected to the state whatsoever. After 1884, when they established the hospital, they now have a direct tie to Gojong. But Underwood and Heron do not have the direct tie. It's specifically Allen. So because of this, everything flows through Allen if you want to get to Gojong. But this is not a one-way street. Because what happens is then Gojong will use that one pressure point, Allen, to pressure all the other missionaries. Now, there's a certain aspect of Korean statecraft or Confucian statecraft that you need to understand. So this is the Donghak peasant uprising. I'm not going to explain it, but there was a peasant uprising in Korea in 1894. And I want to direct your attention to this circle. Now, this circle here is names. So this is a petition, like a flyer, and the people have signed this document, but they signed it in a circle. Anybody want to guess why a circle? What? Yeah, so they do it in a circle because they don't want to know who is the leader. If you do it in a list, they're going to just pick the top name, right? So they do it in a circle to hide it. And one of the things you need to recognize and realize about the Confucian system is it's a humanitarian system. It's benevolence. So the king is supposed to be benevolent. He can't wantonly just kill people, right? And so the person that the king or the official would want to capture is the leader. Because the idea is everybody else is just following. So you have to get the leader. You can't just indiscriminately kill everybody. Well, it's the same thing with Allen, right? So Gojong wants to control the leader, whom he believes to be Allen. And then through that, wants to pressure all the other missionaries. And that's exactly what is happening at Jejuan and through Jejuan. Because the mission board back home in New York said, wait, we have this wonderful tie with the king. Let's not risk it. We'll let Allen make the final decision. Okay, so was this really the case? I will suggest it is, because Allen eventually leaves and he decides to accompany a group to Washington, D.C. So he temporarily stops being missionary. Now, Heron has stepped into that same position that Allen had occupied before. Heron and Underwood start to fight. Now, Heron says, wait a minute, let's not be so aggressive in our missionary policy. And Underwood is like, well, yeah, whatever, right? So Underwood and Heron start to fight. And one of the conflicts surrounds a trip that he'll take to on his honeymoon. So he marries a woman by the name of Lilith Horton and then Underwood. After she gets married, she takes her name. Now, by the way, Lilith Underwood is one of the most important women missionaries in Korea, right? And she's written a lot of stories on Korea. But they get married, and for their honeymoon, he decides that what he wants to do, he wants to take a trip through the northern half of Korea. Now, one thing that I don't know if you know this, but the locus of Protestantism strength in Korea prior to 1945 is north of the 38th parallel. Right? So there are all these already, even before the Protestant missionaries get to Korea in 1884, there are people who want to convert to Protestantism living in the northwestern half of the peninsula. So Underwood wants to go see these groups. Now, before he leaves, the Korean government sends a warning to the U.S. legation saying, look, don't forget, no proselytizing, right? You can't practice Christianity. And so before Underwood can embark on his trip, he needs to get a travel document authorizing his travel. And when he meets the head of the U.S. legation, the head says, look, you must swear to me that you will not baptize anybody on your trip. And Underwood says, I swear. Okay? But then Underwood, what does he do? He's up in the northern regions. Here's the border of China and Korea. He crosses the Yalu River, Amnok River, Korean, and he baptized Koreans on the other side in China. So he's like, and he comes back to Seoul and he brags. He's like, look, I was true both to my oath and to my conscience because I did not baptize anybody in Korea. I did it in China. Now, when Heron learned of this, Heron was incensed. He was so mad. He's like, oh, you know, if other people learn of this, we are going to be such a laughingstock. And so he looks at Underwood and he goes, Underwood, do not, or I'm sure he didn't say Underwood, he said, horse, don't advertise, right? Don't write anything about what you did. And so, horse, what does he do? He writes a long sort of entry in multiple publications in the United States about his journey and his baptism of these Koreans on the other side. So Heron's like incensed, and there's lots of conflict between the two until Heron passes away. So Heron dies, and he becomes the first person buried at Yangwon-jin. All right, so I'm doing time. So much to say. Now, once Heron passes away, the Northern Presbyterian missionaries are like, what are we going to do about this institution? Right? It's so clear to them by this point in 1887 that this is one of the reasons why they just cannot get along. They realized finally that they had unwittingly allowed the Korean government to sort of enter their sphere of work, and this is why they cannot be missionaries. So after the Heron's burial, they have a meeting, and they're like, we need to renegotiate terms with the Korean government. After this meeting, Allen appears, talks to Underwood, and he's like, you know, I know you want to renegotiate these terms, but you understand this is a government hospital. You do not have the power to do this. Underwood says, no, what are you talking about? Of course we do. Once again, they devolve into a fight, but the mission board, again, sides with Allen, saying Allen has the right to appoint the next head. So Allen appoints Robert Hardy. Robert Hardy, you might know this person. He is the person who starts the great revivals that will lead to the Pyongyang Great Revival in 1907. Okay? But he was a medical missionary with the Methodists. And then it'll go to a man by the name of C.C. Vinton. And now Vinton, he is so fed up with the hospital that he decides that he's only going to stay there for like an hour or two every day. And he's going to do other things, right? And eventually, by the time we get to about 1893, this hospital is sort of like an eyesore. Northern Presbyterians want nothing to do with it. Gojong wants nothing to do with it. Nobody wants anything to do with it. And a man by the name of Oliver Avison, he comes to this institution to take the headship, and he decides, we're done. We're done. We're going to quit. We're going to stop. Now, the problem from the side of the Korean government is they don't want this institution either. And so they negotiate with Avison to give the Northern Presbyterians full control over this institution on a temporary basis, but it becomes a full-time basis in the end. And this is, from this point, Avison will then make connection with the man by the name of Louis Severance Hospital, right? He will donate lots of money. They will expand this institution. They will start a medical school, and sort of, once again, we have Yonsei. All right, so I want to sort of skip and to the end here, and to consider how should we understand this sort of initial conflict between these three individuals. Now, to a certain point, I haven't really talked about, but it's been implicit, the challenges of starting a new life in Korea. It's not an accident that Alan and Heron eventually both sort of supported this idea of let's be, let's stay within the boundaries that have been set by the state, because they had something to do in Korea. They were both doctors. Underwood was not the same. Underwood was an ordained pastor. What had he been trained to do? He'd been trained to proselytize, to baptize, right? These are the things that he's been trained to do to go to Korea. But these are the very things that he's not allowed to do. And so one of the things you need to think about when you're looking at these people, these early conflicts, is that they're sitting there asking the question, is it worth it? This is exactly the question that Underwood is asking himself. My brother, he runs a typewriter company. I have money. I could have gone anywhere. I could have been anything. I decided to go be a missionary in Korea. But I can't. When you're reading his letters, you can see that he searches for all these different things that he could do to be useful. He starts orphanages. He wants to start schools, right? He's searching for a purpose in Korea, but he cannot be the very thing that he went to go be. And so one of the things that I find really interesting about these first three cohort of missionaries, and when we think about them, is, well, this question, right? So this is also, I think, Moksanim, you had this picture like 2 weeks ago, right? Anna Kendricks, and I know my dad likes this saying, if I had 1,000 lives to give Korea, or to give, Korea should have them all. Right? And we valorize that, right? Wow, it's so amazing this person wants to sacrifice. Well, the simple truth is, most missionaries, I'm sure Anna must have thought this too at a certain point, was it worth it? Is my life worth it? Is it worth coming here? And when I think about this church, even 1955, I wonder how many people, immigrants, came to the United States and thought, is it worth it? Right? Is it worth the suffering of my children, my wife, my husband, my family being separated from home, figuring out how to speak this language that I don't understand, this strange food that I need to eat? What are these things, chopsticks that I can't use, right? Like, is this all worth it? Underwood, you need to realize, at a certain point, almost said no. Actually, he said no. He submitted his resignation. But for some reason, at the last minute, he rescinded that. And he's like, we'll give it one more chance. Right? And so when you think about this, I think that first generation of missionaries who went to Korea would have understood and empathized with the Korean-American immigrant experience in Korea on multiple levels, whether it's the first generation, second, or third. They confronted very similar challenges of language, culture, society, raising families, and considering Korea their home. And so even though we have two tales, whether it's these American missionaries going to Korea or Koreans coming to America, they're all connected by church. We have two tales, but one church. And with that, thank you. All right, so I think I made up for time. Okay, so I hope there are questions. It's always embarrassing when nobody asks a question after our talks. All right.
So when we were asked earlier about the connections, one of the absolute connections, which I wasn't thinking about at the time, was this Board of Foreign Missions, which really supervised the distribution of missionaries and established their priorities all around the globe. American Indian Ministry was under the Board of Foreign Mission until about the end of the 1890s, and then with the churches, the Presbyterian churches, they established the Board of National Missions, but the priorities and the sense of distributing missionaries to different places came from that model. So that actually is one thing we had in common. And most American Indian churches that still exist today, their histories were where their pastors were assigned from the Board of Foreign Missions. So we'll talk about that, maybe some of the depths of that. But that was one thing that actually I hadn't thought about. That, again, those priorities were set, and some of those challenges about the competition and how the resources were distributed affected American Indian Ministry here.
Yeah, money. It's all about money. Every single letter written by a missionary during the 19th and 20th century, they all I would say about 80% mentioned money. We need more money, right? Korea's really expensive. We need more money.
Hi, I'm Elder here at church here. Now, question is that's it really, the story you just gave us, that interaction between the first three, sort of, for Korea is a giant of Korean Christianity who started. But it seems like, but how come Korea is such huge in taking this new faith into that? But look at the three leaders, the American missionaries. There were, of course, there are a lot of fault, their own problems. But a lot of other countries, they went to missionaries. It's not successful as Korea. I mean, so which means Koreans work in themselves. Somehow, they made it that it happened, or it's sort of. It's amazing to see that, you look at it. The first, the missionaries are like great giants and just working out together well. Just really great, show the great examples. But you bring out a little bit different insight to it. So how come that Korea is just? You think that it's a blossomed some ways.
Okay, thank you, Elder Kang, for that question. Okay, so I was expecting this question. I always get this question, right? And I wish I knew, well, first answer, I wish I knew the answer, because then I would write a best-selling book. So like all missiologists would want to buy my book because I uncovered this secret. But let me answer that question by starting off by saying, how many Christians do you think there were in Korea in 1945? How many people? A million? How many people think a million? Any ideas? Like a couple 100,000? Does that sound a lot to you? When you compare, that's not a lot, okay? A couple 100,000. We're talking like a percent, right? So one of the things that all missionaries will do when they write their reports back home, no missionary ever writes back home saying, we're not doing a good job. They all write, we are doing a great job. The local people here, even though we have challenges, are really interested in Christianity. So part of it, we have to sort of sift between fact and fiction. So that explosive growth doesn't really happen in the first half of the 20th century. It happens in the second, during the 1960s. And so part of that story then it has to do with the Korean War, sort of the poverty, the missionaries going into Korea with money and providing social services and humanitarian aid and relief. And then also the very fact that all these immigrants are flooding from these northwestern territories that are now communists into South Korea and being very motivated to sort of find and spread their faith. So I think all those factors have to be incorporated into any answer that tries to locate why did it succeed. But just be aware, at least up to 1945, I don't think there was that much difference between the situation in Korea and other countries in Asia. Maybe I should have taken more time. I mean, that is a great question, and that is a great point. It's really important. Actually, I have a good friend who does Korean Catholicism, and no matter what I send him, the very first thing he asks me is the very same question: what about the Catholics? Why are you not thinking about the Catholics? Now, the simple answer for today's talk is because we're in a Protestant church, and Reverend Lee asked me to talk about, I think, the Protestant missionaries. But the more complex answer is, I think, especially during the late 19th and early 20th century, there's a danger then to conflate the Catholics and Protestants as one, because the experiences are also very, very different. And especially because the Pope is controlling so much of what's happening in Korea and dictating directives, that their relationship with the state is significantly different from all these separate sort of denominations, Protestant denominations that are operating. And so it would be, I just personally feel that it would be doing a disservice to the history of Catholicism in Korea to make a claim that this was exactly the same with the Catholics, because I don't think it was. I think there are significant differences.
Question about the other missionaries rather than just the three persons that you mentioned. There are people like Gail from Canadian, also Appenzeller. Did they have a similar kind of experience, similar kind of conflict between them, or was it more broad?
Oh, great. That's a great question. So he asked a question about Gail and then also Appenzeller. Now, Gail, when he first goes to Korea, will go as a member of the Northern Presbyterians. He's Canadian, but the Canadians are not in Korea yet, so he goes with the Northern Presbyterians, an American branch, but then he eventually goes to the Canadians. Now, Appenzeller, he's Methodist. Now, the Methodists are very, very different because, number one, they have a superintendent. And the superintendent makes the decisions, right? So it's like top down, you do what I say. Number two, the Methodists will go to Korea and they will also establish a Western-style hospital. But this Western-style hospital will not be officially associated with the Korean government. And they brag that, yes, Jejuwon, they have this, they started first and they're associated with the Korean government, but we are seeing as many patients as Jejuwon, if not more, and we can still proselytize because we don't have this government pressure. So the situation with the Methodists is significantly different, in part because they don't have this relationship with the state. So the state has infiltrated, so that's part of what I was trying to say, has infiltrated the work of the Northern Presbyterians, and they're able to affect it in that manner.
Really as noble and exemplary in terms of having that love of God, love of the unsaved that really got them to do it. What was really motivating them in your eyes, having read all those letters?
Yeah, I think that's also, so the question is, what was motivating these missionaries, right? I would not besmirch a missionary. I think most of them went with good purpose. Right? But I will say one thing. I would not say that it's downward mobility. Because this is another thing, like I was trying to point out. It is really hard to become a missionary, which means that people wanted to become a missionary. So this is like the great adventure, like literally the great adventure. These are people who are excited to go live a life of adventure. When they would come back home and they would go speak at churches, they were like superstars. Like, let's hear what the missionary is going to come tell us, right? And so this is not like, I would not characterize it as a downward mobility. In many ways, this was like befitting of their status as these college graduates, that they were able to get this position in a Fortune 500 company and then be stationed abroad, and they could make their mark on the world. So I think you have to look at it from that perspective. It's not like today, like these are not religious people who are just, like, anybody can be a missionary. I don't know if that's true or not. But, like, this, it's not like we're just going to go be a missionary today. No, it was hard.
Missionaries all this time, but then I'm really surprised to hear that how it was based upon like Western influence and whatnot too. So I don't know if this is kind of an abstraction kind of question, but when I look at Korean spirituality today in Korea and these like mega churches and all these things, do you think there is an influence of like Western, like like we did this well and we grew our churches to be like the mega churches for? I mean, is there any sort of lingerings of that kind of part there, and maybe that's the reason why the next generation have started to leave the church, because they see a lot of this like gross like capitalism, all this kind of stuff happening in the church?
All right, that is a great question. It's very all things are complex, right? I think one thing that I forgot to mention that maybe I should have mentioned, that the missions in Korea sort of starts later than other places. It starts in the late 19th century. And Korean missionaries in Korea are already obsessed with this question of indigenization. So they want to make sure that the Christianity that is established in Korea is Korean. Now, this will become a problem in and of itself, but they're already thinking along these lines, right? Like, how can we make, like, enculturate this religion to match local culture and society? So that's the first sort of answer to that question. But more specifically to like things like the mega churches, first mega church, I would say, in the world is Korea, right? Full gospel church. Right, so this phenomenon of the megachurch itself and the melding of capitalism with Christianity and Protestantism, that's really not an American thing. That's a Korean thing. And part of that has to do with the Korean War and the poverty that sort of arose out of that. And people are gathering in these big numbers, and it's very sort of indigenous the way they're doing morning prayer, dawn prayer. That's not an American thing. You're not going to find Americans waking up at 4 o'clock to go to church to pray every Monday, right? That's an American thing. That's a Korean thing that one scholar has argued comes from Taoism. So there's a practice in Taoism where you go out to the mountains early in the morning to pray. So like so what we'll see in Korea in the 1950s and 60s is a lot of like really Korean elements injected into Christianity. And that's what we're seeing with like these mega churches. Do we have more time for questions or how we, okay.
For those who are joining YouTube live stream, they can hear the questions if you don't use the microphone, so it will be great.
You talked about being a pioneer, and actually, when I think about first gen, our parents who came, I think of them as pioneers. But the interesting thing is, I'm a second gen, and a lot of times second gens we grow up different than our first gen. So we're not pioneers. We don't have that pioneer spirit. We're actually very soft because we were raised soft by our parents who pioneered everything. So, especially Don. Just kidding. And so the question for me is, you said that right at the end that there's similarities, that those first missionaries would empathize with our first immigrants. When you see, and then you said in the very beginning that there's multiple, they didn't go for 10 years, or even they were there for lifetimes and they had children. And so do you see similarities with their second gen, I guess you can call them second gen as well, their children that grew up in Korea, right, and they got married, and then with us as being second gen or growing up here and getting married? And
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's one very significant difference when we start to talk about second generation. I think the second generation missionary kids, MK, I mean, there's this concept called like third culture kid. And of course, these missionary kids who are growing up in Korea experience this. Like, we're not really Korean, we're not really American. But I think there definitely is more of a connection within that second generation of missionaries who feel more like I'm an American, as opposed to maybe sort of like the dislocation of second generation Korean Americans per se, as they try to assimilate to, I say they, I'm also a second generation Korean American, as we attempt to assimilate into American culture and to decide what exactly we are. But I still think the first generation of Protestant missionaries, the pioneers, would have empathized with raising their children in Korea and worried about, like, who are they? Like, are they Korean? Are they American? Like, how can we give them the American experience, or to make sure that they have this sort of identity within them, right? That, like, they don't feel quite lost. I think I don't think they had the term third culture kid, but I think they understood inherently sort of the challenges for second generations who were born and raised. Now, I will say, a lot of these missionaries, and even up to the 1950s, they left Korea because they were worried about their kids, right? Like, how are we going to raise our children in this country? And what is the future prospects? Like, things like, what happens if my child gets sick? Where are we, like, medical care? So it's sort of similar, but also then very different. And no, we are not soft. What are you talking about? It's hard growing up in America with racism as a Korean American. Please, we are not soft. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much once again. Let's give a round of applause to our speakers once again, Dr. Cha and Elder Street-Stewart, for their dynamic and enlightening messages. Thank you so much once again. It was truly amazing and inspiring to learn about our history in order to appreciate our freedom and salvation in many ways. It's been an amazing day in so many ways. Thank you so much for your participation. We have an exciting day number 2 program for you in store for you. We look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. Just to go over a few things about tomorrow's session. Our first session, morning session, session number 3, will begin at 9 o'clock. And our keynote speaker will be Dr. Jane Hong. So we look forward to seeing you. And then tomorrow, as far as the parking is concerned, there will be 11 reserved parking spaces. You don't have to compete. There will be additional meter parking available as well in front of our church. Thank you all so much, and enjoy the evening. Thank you so much.